And here I was beginning to think all that characterization he got back in Season 1, especially with the Tarkin incident, was all going to be for nothing. The enemy mine scenario is a really common one, but it's actually probably one of my favorite examples of cliches are not necessarily bad. Because it is a very cliched story. But I can name several fairly good stories that came out of the enemy mine concept, including enemy mine itself. And I think it works very well in this kind of a situation, too, especially since, as I mentioned back in Season 1, we already have a personal connection between Callus and Zeb. So having two who are already, connected to each other in a narrative and thematic way, it makes sense for them to be the ones who have to rely on each other to survive. A quick aside, did you notice there was this really throwaway line that all the Geonosians are dead? I want to come back to that later. Just keep that in the back of your mind for a bit. So there's this bit where, they've crashed and, oh, no. And he says, do you really think your friends will come for you? Well, yeah, but your friends fled. This is despite the fact that Callus knows his people have a habit of coming back and, rescuing each other despite everything. This has happened as recently as, as early as the first episode of the show. It's also interesting that Zeb had all of the opportunities in the world to just straight up kill Callus. And Callus had several to kill Zeb, and both deliberately don't take it. This is one of those things that can be argued back and forth. It boils down to the fact that from a purely military perspective, what both did was wrong. That is the enemy, and they should kill them. But a military perspective is a matter of formulas and equations. It's a design attempting to balance the equation as sufficiently as possible to get to victory. It's one of the reasons why, years later, I still quote Mass Effect 3 with that wonderful phrase, cold calculus. Because that is what a military mindset is when it comes to an enemy and situation, an engagement, right? And now I know that sounds contradictory because I've talked before about the ideal of the military, as represented by Sheridan over in Babylon 5, but that's a different thing. I mean, like, tactics, strategy. So what they both do is functionally stupid, but very, I hate to use this word, human. Because an individual, a person, isn't a military. And it's so much more difficult for a person to murder another person in cold blood, especially when that person is functionally helpless. And I know this sounds like a stupid thing, but I like how that's basically the first layer of how they end up not going after each other. That then leads to the pragmatism of them actually needing each other, and that leads to a grudging respect and mutual admiration based on what they know. We also find out, this is a little bit of whitewashing, admittedly, and I'm not sure if I like this. We'll see where they go with this. But we find out that Callus actually didn't take it from someone. It was offered to him after he defeated an honor guard one-on-one. And he was very against the purging of the planet. Now, on the one hand, that is whitewashing, like I said. But on the other hand, I'm kind of okay with it in this case, because it does line up with several bits of his characterization we've had throughout the series so far. That he is a antagonist, but he is not overtly malicious. He is not the kind of person who is, and then I will torture you to death for my amusement. We've seen those kind of characters in this show so far. We've seen Tarkin, and all three Inquisitors have all been kind of leaning in that direction. He's been a lot more, I want to win, but within the realm of reasonability. I also want to comment on a couple of points that he brings up. Two quotes in specific that I wrote down. One is actually from Zeb. Zeb says, "You're so quick to give up hope." And I find myself thinking that right there hit the nail on the head in a way that I'm not sure either of them realized. This is something that's been a recurring trend in Season 2 in general, if you've been paying attention. That a lot of the people who either don't join the rebels, or are doing their own thing against the Empire, or have actively joined the Empire, do so specifically because they had no hope. Because they looked at the situation and said, yeah, no, that's not happening. And I feel like Callus is exactly in that kind of category. Either he truly believed in what the Empire was, which is actually unlikely considering he knows how bad it is, or what's the alternative? But see, this leads me to my second quote. Zeb mentions, they start talking about how you're not supposed to ask questions. And Zeb says, oh, you're worried you're going to find out that your precious Empire wiped out the Geonosians. And his response is, Why would they do that? What would possibly be the point? I like that. I like that a lot. It's one of those really quiet things that establishes a lot of mentality, a lot of perspective right there. Because the sane, rational, decent mind would never consider something like genocide. Genocide's horrible. Incredibly horrible. I mean, forgive me for saying that water is wet, but you get the point. And it's such a nightmarishly monstrous concept that and I'm going to say this definitively, any sane and rational mind would not consider it as an acceptable outcome, as something that should be desired. This then leads to the nature of Callus considering the situation. Why would the Empire ever do this? What could possibly be the point? And now he's starting to ask questions. As a quick aside, we also see some of the other side of this, too. There's been hints and references throughout the whole series so far. Tarkin himself directly referenced this. But they actually name-drop Saw Gerrera. You remember him, right, from Clone Wars? And I suppose also from Rogue One and from the upcoming Fallen Knight, Jedi whatever game that's coming out. I mention that because we know Saw was a bit of an extremist back in the Clone Wars. And it helps to emphasize, in the immediate wake of what we found out with Cham back in, I think just the last episode, we now have a little bit more insight into how the other rebels are operating. Once again, we don't really have a rebel alliance yet. Not really. Not in any structural, functional way. There's just a whole bunch of different cells who may or may not be in contact with each other, but are all just doing their own thing. And we know that several of them are a lot more violent and horrible than our heroes. They are, in a very literal and functional way, terrorists. Now, you could argue that the main characters are terrorists. That's something that I don't want to get into. But there is no arguing that Gerrera and his ilk are terrorists, in like the worst connotations of that word. And that, of course, leads to the mentality. It must be so easy to help convince some people who are either joining or are a part of the Empire that what they're doing is right, when they have examples like Saw to use as propaganda. There's a nice scene where he's got his gun pointing at him, and Zeb is like, and then he shoots the guy behind him, which is what I was expecting to begin with, and reaches out a hand to him. It's incredibly cliched and way too on the nose, but I'll admit I still found myself smiling at it. Literally reaching out a hand to the other to help him up. Of course. And then, they talk things out. They admit to a few things. He even gets the honorable bow as he's leaving, and he leaves him with the heated meteor thing, which he holds on to, by the way, as a souvenir, which is a nice touch. You'll notice there's a lot of really excellent directing in the final scenes. There's only 2 lines of dialogue in the final few scenes, which is Admiral Constantine and Agent Callus, and that's it. Everything else is conveyed without dialogue, but it's done wonderfully. We see that Callus is... I love it. He's being approached callously, basically. Sorry for the pun. But nobody cares that he's back. He's just another officer. There's no camaraderie there. And you can tell that he's the kind of person who does like and gravitates towards camaraderie. The way he talked about his old crew, the one that died on Onderon to the bounty, yeah, you can tell there's something there desiring that. And when he goes into his room, he has nothing there. It's a bare, empty, barren room. But he's got shelves. Now that's important because that means he could decorate it if he wants to. He just chooses not to. And so the first thing he puts to decorate it is that meteor strike, that chunk that helped keep him warm. His first dip into sentimentality. And Agent Callus is left with a lot of things to think about. This might actually be my favorite episode to date. It's really, really well done. Very well presented and executed. And, of course, is leading us in the direction of a change of status quo, which I'm always in favor of. Hope you've enjoyed my thoughts. I'll see you next time.